Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.gov. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our guest today, we welcome back one of our favorites, Tom Netting, who's here to give us an update on the results of the latest negotiated rulemaking in Washington and what's going on at the Department of Education, as well as possible implications with the House changing hands and Representative Virginia Foxx becoming the chair of the House Education Committee. Tom has worked in public policy for over 28 years, advocating before Congress, federal agencies, and state governments on behalf of private institutions of higher education and post-secondary education companies. Tom is a leader in strategic policy development and advocacy and has been working in this area for a long, long time. Tom, welcome back to the show.
How are you, Drumm? It's great to talk to you again.
And you as well. It seems like it's been, at least 4 years, but we haven't had a change of administration, yet. So I know it's not been 4 years.
No, but a lot of the administration's issues are timely and topical, to say the least.
Oh, no kidding. Especially with the elections we just had. The House is going to swap over to the Republican side, which means you're going to have a new, it's not going to be rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Instead of Education and Labor, it'll be Education and Workforce Committee. So we got a lot to talk about, I think.
Absolutely.
So how do you want to kick this off? I mean, it's been 6 months since we spoke. There hasn't been a lot of water. There have been floods underneath the bridge. Where do we start?
Well, I think one of the major floods that is relevant for all is the Department of Education, and more specifically the Biden administration's efforts on student debt cancellation, part of their three-pronged initiative that you'll recall from back in August that was intended to provide restructuring of the debt-to-earnings regulations, was also looking at ways to assess and greater enforce compliance by all institutions, and acknowledgement that we're reinstituting the regulatory oversight and enforcement committee. But the major area of that particular three-pronged ability for relief was the Student Borrower Relief Program and the opportunity for cancellation of $10,000 to $20,000 in student debt, depending on whether or not you previously received a Pell grant and where you were on a mean-tested level of between 125 and 250 individual versus joint earnings during the pandemic. The reality is that the Biden administration heading into the elections and post-election were very much working towards providing as many borrowers with relief under that proposal as they could, leading up to what was at that time, back when we last spoke in August, a December deadline, end of December, January 1, 2023 deadline for reconstitution or turning back on the switch on student loan repayment. Well, again, the floods that have come included litigation, 6+ different suits filed against the Biden administration and efforts to provide student loan debt cancellation. 2 of those went to the Supreme Court based on student requests and were dismissed without even any dialogue from the Chief Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who was to review that information. But subsequent to that, we have 2 pieces of litigation that have gone through the court systems, the Fifth and Eighth Court, the Court of Appeals, and now sit before the Supreme Court, so much so that the Supreme Court has established a February 28th, 2023 date for oral arguments on the 2 different proposals that are out there. The first case involves a legal challenge from 6 Republican states led by the Attorney Generals of Nebraska and Missouri. The second is a lawsuit brought by a conservative group on behalf of 2 Texas borrowers because they feel that the proposals didn't provide them relief. The prior 6-state proposal looked more at the impact on states. You'll note that those are 6 GOP Republican-led states.
Really?
But the concerns around what the changes and this debt relief would do to state level issues. And also in one particular case, Missouri, MOHELA, one of the major contractors with the Department of Education for servicing the direct loan programs, what implications this might have on that entity, and therefore also not only their profitability, but also the implications of that for the state, all of the constituents within the state that are employees of MOHELA, and the continuation of those type of concerns.
Mm-hmm. Now, it's kind of interesting because when I first looked at the debt forgiveness, I felt like, yeah, it's probably a good thing, especially for the demographic groups that they are targeting. But I was wondering, until I had one of my guests on, if it was more a political, reaching out to get, more votes, et cetera. I mean, I know that's the way a lot of folks look at it, but one of my guests was on and they were talking about how because of the student debt that folks are carrying nowadays, they're not able to go out and really buy a house or other things like that. Obviously, the cost of housing has gone up significantly over the past 5 years, but it's really preventing millennials for stepping into the earning capacities that they could. They're too laden down with student debt. Does that make sense?
Again, it does, Drumm, but you also have to remember, and this is one of the key points that you can take your position on either side of this, but the reality is the borrower was educated by every institution under the statute of what a loan is and what the obligations are of an individual to repay that loan. And if they've taken on the responsibility, that responsibility is, many would argue, is theirs to bear. Yes, there are concerns around the interest rates and the accrual of interest and the circumstances that seem to proliferate the inability for individuals to have a hard time ever coming close to starting to pay down principal as the interest continues to accrue and amount year over year. That's why you're seeing a number of proposals, Democrats and Republicans alike, looking to either cap the overall interest rate accrual or find other means to limit the overall expense of student loans. That's one of the areas where I think you might find some unity over time. But the reality is the alternative for those who are in opposition to or having a problem with the Biden administration's proposal is that they believe that the loans that were the responsibility of the individual are now being consumed and asked to be repaid by the taxpayers and other individuals or the federal government relating to the taxpayer as the responsible party to facilitate or write off that debt. And there are people that say, hey, I repaid my student debt. There are individuals that say, I never had student debt. And there are even also a number of other individuals that realistically are saying, wait a minute, this is a one-time proposal. So if I come after, I'm not going to receive any of these benefits. And that's where a number of the challenges are coming in, is I think that everything that the Biden administration is attempting to do is meritorious and certainly helpful at a time when we see so many economic pressures pushing down on individuals. But there are a lot of people that have questions of the overall impact of this for a certain group at a certain time and the impact on others who either don't get to avail themselves of the same responsibilities of the past or won't see the same benefit unless this one-time program, because something that is replicated in the future. And then again, you're going to have the same questions potentially asked. Those are all policy questions. There is one overarching question that the Republicans have focused on, and in particular, both of the lawsuits that are pending, and that's whether or not legally the Biden administration has the ability and the authority to put forth this change. It will be very interesting to see how the Supreme Court views that capability. Traditionally, it would be Congress's responsibility, but for obviously economic reasons and pandemic reasons, and because of the HOPE Act and a greater authority that was granted to the president in times of pandemic and national emergency, they believe they have the authority to do this. I know I'm going a little long-winded here, but you can see, and that's one of the reasons why this is something that doesn't fit into a soundbite right now. This is a huge issue, and one of, like you said, the major watershed events that I think will be coming before the Supreme Court with relation to student aid.
Yeah, I'm not going to ask you to pull out your crystal ball on this one because I have no idea, and I suspect you may have a hint. But what I will ask is, what's the impact of this to university presidents? What is it that they should be thinking about with this whole thing?
Well, I think the university presidents, as with the entire higher education community, needs to continue to be aware of it. Some of the things that I think that all universities should be doing right now, because of this stoppage of the cancellation by the Biden administration, and now a future pushback of loan repayment. It was supposed to, again, start in January. We've now pushed it back to the middle of 2023. One of the things that the department is doing right now, and was encouraging the institutions of higher education to do between August and the end of the year, when the Biden administration announced this proposal, was to have all of their students go to studentaid.gov and make sure that their information is timely and accurate for current borrowers. I believe that school presidents should continue to suggest that all current students make sure that their student aid data and under studentaid.gov is accurate and correct. That's where the lending community will ultimately be able to help between now and July 1 to give the current borrowers more information on their responsibilities and the transition back into repayment. It also potentially, depending on how strong of an alumni organization you have, I've seen a lot of institutions going to their alumni and also reminding them of that, because keeping in mind, the benefits are for prior borrowers. So the opportunity for relief comes to individuals that have been in the past. And so you might want a number of your individuals to be aware of that. The department has done a good job of publicizing this themselves. Of the 40 plus million potentially eligible individuals, at last count, or when they stopped reporting because of the various lawsuits, the last time they stopped reporting, there were well over 26 to almost 30 million of those borrowers that had already put forth their application. The applications they can't do right now, but again, they can make sure they're in the system and that the system is aware of the right point of contact for them. They can review where they are or in their loan borrowing status, the current amounts, and make sure everything's up to date. I would encourage the presidents to be doing that, staying abreast of the litigation to see what determinations are forthcoming, and then obviously act accordingly. There is good news on the horizon for all institutions, and we've already seen it. College presidents probably heard from their FSA departments that cohort default rates for fiscal year 19, keep in mind it's a 3-year trailing indicator, went down for all institutions. A lot of that is because after 2.5 years of lack of repayment, responsibility by borrowers, and all of those individuals being counted in repayment, that the rates are going down. We're going to see that continue, obviously, for 1 to 2, 3 more marking periods. What the residents and FSA should be protecting against is everybody, Democrats, Republican, Biden administration, and the department, all acknowledge that once the transition back to repayment begins, we all need to work very diligently and vigilantly to ensure that individuals, especially those that were previously in default and have gotten out of default through Fresh Start and this 2.5-year window, don't revert back to old bad practices, and work to make it so that now 4 to 5 years from now, when the cohort default rates are based on, yet again, the repayment once it's turned back on, that we don't see a huge spike up in defaults. But this, one of the good things here is this really is a restarting of the repayment side of student loans and gives everybody an opportunity to start anew.
I think that's a great point, and it's also a great idea of reaching out to your alumni through your newsletters, whatever. It's just another touch point that presidents can use to keep their alumni base informed and, stay in contact with them. Let's swap horses. Appropriations bill. As we're recording this, it's going through the House and the Senate reconciliation right now. What's it look like for higher ed, and what's important for us?
Omnibus appropriations is, in fact, like you said, literally Congress hopes to be done in the Senate and potentially the House today, Wednesday, what are we today, the 21st. And the good news for education is that once again, education as a line item received an overall increase. It wasn't the $88+ billion in discretionary funding that the Biden administration had requested, but it was an increase, and it is roughly $79.8 billion that education overall received out of the $1.7 trillion in the overall bill. The key things in higher education that I think are most relevant and important, major benefits once again for students and for borrowers. On the student side, we see an increase in the maximum federal Pell Grant by an additional $500, bringing the maximum federal Pell to $7,395 for the upcoming academic award year 23-24. Again, this falls short of the request by the Biden administration and their efforts to seek to double Pell Grant funding, but it does speak to increases, and again, more money for grant assistance, not only there, but in the campus-based aid programs and the like are all beneficial for students. We do see additional funding in the form of both campus-based as well as need-based aid in SEOG, TRIO, and the other forms of grant assistance programs, and some additional money for the HBCUs, minority serving institution, tribal institutions, and Hispanic serving institutions. So those are all beneficial, again, to both the borrower or the students coming in to help supplement and try and candidly help reduce overall student loan borrowing and costs, again, as that continues to be the major issue. The one thing that the Biden administration was heavily promoting and attempting to try and obtain through this appropriations bill was additional money for the line item of student aid administration. Now, that's kind of a catch-all. What it's predominantly used for is, as the name would imply, the ability for the department to run and operate the federal student loan programs, the infrastructure, the work and the contracts with the lending community, as well as with the servicing community and collections community. What also goes into there is staffing and other areas of administration. The Biden administration had requested a substantial increase in that particular line item this time around to continue to help with the transition to a new federal student financial aid program. They are in the process and have been now for some 8 to 9 years of attempting to transition the overall program. We've gone through several different COOs that have attempted to put their alma mater on that process. It still isn't complete. And with the transition from Trump to Biden, we also have seen some changes in that overall dynamic. We've also seen requests for additional staffing. The FSA team and Office of Policy Planning and Innovation, the two major facets of higher ed, needed more staff. We've seen a dearth in those individuals over the years where positions not filled or cutbacks led to a smaller size staff. And we're suffering the reality of that. The federal negotiated rulemaking process and all of the efforts of the Biden administration to put forth the 2021-2022 negotiated rulemaking, all the issues they wanted to bring forward, they had to basically table half of them because they didn't have the staff to complete all the regulatory write-ups in order to meet the master calendar rules. So we sit here with borrower defense to repayment, total and permanent disability, closed school discharge, false claims discharge, interest capitalization, and a number of vitally important regulatory revisions, the 90-10 rule, Pell grants for prisoners, all having been made final rules this November and subject to implementation July 1 of next year. But we also have financial responsibility and administrative capability regulations, revisions to the gainful employment and the reconstitution of gainful employment regulations, and certification procedures, as well as ATB, as issues that are pending NPRM publication, likely in April of 2023, as outlined in the unified calendar of the Office of OIRA under OMB. So, you've got a lot of those moving parts that are playing into, and the staffing, where I was leading with this, is with more staff, they could hope to do more. Without the funding, and this is where I was headed with all of this, they were asking for additional funding for staff to help transition the student loan program further. And as the Biden administration has also announced, they look to reestablish the Oversight and Enforcement Division within the department as well, and they needed staffing for that. Well, with the funding that was requested versus the funding that had been provided, which is basically almost a straight line from 2022 fiscal year to 2023 fiscal year, it doesn't appear that there's a lot of that funding, certainly to provide all of what's necessary. Those will then therefore limit and make it so the department is going to have to stretch real hard to determine where they're going to find money. I submit to you probably for the staff more than anything, because they've got to do the changes to the student loan system and the infrastructure. So it could leave them with, yet again, limited staffing in order to continue to try and move forward with regulatory review and revision internal, and the ability to have an enforcement arm go back out and doing oversight reviews and visits of institutions that they deem as high risk.
Yeah. So it sounds like for presidents, the big news is the Pell Grant increase of $500. That's the big thing, and some other funding for campus-based and need-based financial aid. Those sound like the big ones.
There are big ones for presidents, but again, I wouldn't lose sight of the fact that some of these other changes, the financial responsibility revisions and regulations, are things that the school community is wanting to see changed. And the fact that they're having to wait longer for those, especially when you talk your private nonprofit institutions, they have been heavily involved in seeking revisions to the financial responsibility criterion, Drumm, because it doesn't work effectively for the assessment of the way in which private nonprofits operate. So they really needed some help on the regulatory front, and the slow manner in which the efforts to bring forth the relief or the reforms necessary, it binds them up. And, you look at some of these others, and, depending on your side of the focus, some of these other changes with certification procedures that they were hoping to have happen, again, them taking longer to go into effect. Now, the good news is that you can do early implementation of final regulations once they're put forward. But the fact that we still are waiting for the NPRM, much less the final regulations, are probably going to be frustrating to some presidents with some key issues bottled up in all of those groupings. I don't think anybody, quite honestly, is going to lose any sleep over the fact that gainful employment, which has been so hard to implement and such a frustrating issue for all sectors of higher education, the fact that that's not published in final form yet, I don't think people are going to lose any sleep over, but they're darn sure going to be paying attention once that NPRM comes out, as well as some of the others.
And just for those listeners who, like me, don't remember what NPRM means?
Notice of proposed rulemaking. It's the precursor to a final regulation. After the negotiated rulemaking has taken place, the department takes all of the input from the community, brings that internal. If there was consensus reached, they publish the consensus proposal. If consensus was not reached, as in the case with all of the proposals that I'm talking about here, with the exception of ability to benefit, then the department gets the opportunity to take all of the wisdom that was shared with them and write the regulation as they think best. It is published as a notice of proposed rulemaking. There's a window of comment period for all interested parties to reflect on what the department is publishing before it goes into final form. The department then publishes it in final form. Because it's all Title IV related, it falls under the master calendar rule, which means that it has to be published in a final form on or before November 1st of a preceding year to be effective July 1 of the subsequent year. So all of those issues would not go into effect with changes until July 1 of next year. So if you're, again, those private nonprofits in particular, and I'm not picking on them, I think it's a favorable circumstance, some of the Federal Register and some of the financial responsibility changes that are looking to be hopefully incorporated there, if the department gives the opportunity when they publish it in final form for early implementation, then maybe it goes into effect and the schools can have benefits between November and July of next year.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's very helpful and good refresher for me. Moving right along, there's so much to discuss in Washington right now. Regulatory policies. Let's do this as a lightning round.
Okay.
We already talked about Neg Reg 2021, what's gone into place, what hasn't gone into place. What else can we expect on that?
On the horizon, if they can find the financing for it, is another potential round of negotiated rulemaking. There are still a number of issues, accreditation, TRIO, and other need-based aid programs and campus-based aid programs, and revisions, other types of revisions to the federal student aid delivery programs that were all things the Biden administration was hoping to bring forward in a new round of negotiated rulemaking. We'll see whether or not that transpires because of the limited appropriations dollars. We will still see on the regulatory front, though, an enhanced and a continued effort to focus on cybersecurity, whether that be through the FTC safeguard rules, whether that be through the actual Department of Education revisions to go beyond Gramm-Leach-Bliley into NIST 800-171. And these are technical terms, but IT individuals will know what that is. And quite honestly, presidents of institutions should spend more time with their IT individuals, because the compliance fines and issues, if you're not in compliance, are significant and substantial. So we need to be mindful of those as we go forward as well. The one last thing on the regulatory front that I think is also going to be more prominent in 2023 is, once they get this oversight and enforcement group up, paying attention to what is high on their list. I submit to you that misrepresentation and advertising and recruitment are going to be high on that list.
Mm-hmm. Especially with the latest coming out on the U.S. News and World Report, so many institutions not reporting data correctly.
Absolutely.
And yeah, that's going to be a major. What about Title IX? That's always big on people's radar.
And it should be. Title IX will be also something that comes forward in 2023. Again, I don't have a crystal ball to know when the department may be bringing that forward. And I will once again assert that a lot of the same individuals, Drumm, that are responsible for all of these other regulatory packages are the same ones, along with the attorney group, that are responsible for Title IX. You'll also recall that it took over 18 months for the last set of Title IX regulations to be published from the NPRM to a final regulation. I do believe they'll come out in 2023. If I'm handicapping it, I think it'll probably be mid-year, and it will be a significant revision to those regulations.
Would not surprise me. And, we won't get into the ability of the next administration, if it's not the Biden administration, to overturn things that get published in the middle of an election year, but we won't go there. We just had a change of, or about to have a change of, Republican, Democrat mix in the House. That's going to change a few things.
Goes beyond just that. Even though the Democrats kept the Senate, the 118th Congress brings about a number of new changes in and of itself. You jokingly referred to, but it will become, I suspect, reality, that with the Republicans now taking back control of the House of Representatives during the midterm elections, it will likely result in the Education Committee, which is currently the Education and Labor Committee, reverting back to the Republicans' use of the terms of Education and Workforce Committee. The pendulum swings back and forth with the control of the committee and those uses of what the committee name is. We will certainly also see, I think, some efforts early on in the early parts of February, late part of January, early part of February and beyond, for the Republicans in the House to bring forth a number of hearings that are related to issues that we've already spoken of, the legality of and the operation and focus on student loan debt cancellation. I can assure you will be one of those. The issues on literally the development and revisions to the student loan program system will, I can assure you, be another, up to and including not only how the department is doing with the restructuring of that system, but we haven't heard a lot from the department, and Republicans, as well as Democrats, have asked the department how far along they are in implementing the changes that were statutory as a part of the FAFSA Simplification Act that was promulgated or enacted into law at the end of December 2019. You'll recall that those statutory revisions require the regulations to totally redo the determination of how need-based aid is awarded. It will no longer be estimated family contributions, but will be based more on an index that is related to salaries and employment data. So the changes there are things that you would expect now with a 2023-2024 implementation date to start to see more from the department than Congress has seen from the department on those issues. So those are things that I think will be timely and topical. There probably will be challenges to other portions of both the final regulations that have been published on borrower defense to repayment, as well as some of the other issues, and also probably some questioning and querying of where the department looks to head on the regulations that still have been negotiated, but have not been published as an NPRM and made their way to final yet. Give me a second for one more thing, because we only focus on the House. There is a major change in the Senate. We no longer will have Senator Murray as the chairwoman of the Senate Help Committee. As the Democrats kept control of the Senate, she had the opportunity, because of changes on the Appropriations Committee, to ascend to the chair of the Full Appropriations Committee and where the purse strings are. And she will likely take that opportunity, meaning she will step aside as the chairwoman of the Senate Help Committee. It is very likely that Bernie Sanders will be the incoming chair of that committee. We also had the retirement of Senator Burr as the ranking member on the committee from North Carolina. He is now retired as well. So it is likely that Rand Paul from Kentucky will assume the position of the ranking member on the committee. So we have significant change in the Help Committee, its leadership, and likely its direction.
Yeah. Last question before we go to our standard takeaways. Where is it that Republicans and Democrats can come together to make meaningful change in how higher education is done here in the U.S.?
Where do I think all this leads is it's going to be very interesting to see how both the Help Committee in and of itself starts to find its new dialogue with two very dynamic individuals with, that candidly couldn't be more far apart on most of their domestic policy agenda So how do we find a middle ground over in the Senate? And in the House, where we have established rapport that is a strong rapport between Representative Scott and Representative Fox. They both served in both positions with the gavel in hand and the gavel not in hand, and been able to work at times to find common ground. We'll have to see whether or not, candidly, the Democrats and Republicans in the House can start to develop those areas of common interest and then see where that goes in the Senate. It's going to be tough. I have been one that said that I truly believe you'll see a form of reauthorization of the Higher Education Act in 2023. I am in the minority view in that regard. Most people don't think that the House and the Senate, much less the committees themselves, will be able to get far enough to start to reauthorize the Higher Education Act. I think all of the concerns around student cost, all of the focus on debt cancellation, on borrowing, and the system itself are pushing to where Congress has to act. You'll keep in mind we haven't reauthorized the HEA since 2008, well beyond the normal 6-year period. Something's got to give here. And I think that that's one of the things that may potentially, I know we're going to see new legislation. Certainly, Dr. Fox put forth the Real Reform Act, a Republican view on what should be in that system, the student loan programs, including elimination of public service loan forgiveness eligibility, significant limitations and reconstruction of borrower defense to repayment, as well as eligibility under short-term Pell programs. And that laudable proposal, but one which excluded certain portions of the higher education community, online and proprietary. So there's going to be a lot of things where coming to a middle ground is going to be a hard-fought set of circumstances.
Interesting.
And I know we went real long, but it's been too long since we talked, Drumm, and there's so much to talk about.
Absolutely. We're not going to have to make it as long this time. We'll have to put something on the calendar for, 3-4 months from now rather than 6. 3 takeaways for presidents.
Top 3 takeaways for presidents. As I said, I really encourage you to work with your financial aid departments to ensure that all borrowers are aware of the now July 1st repayment transition. Granted, if they're in school, they're not going to have to start their repayment, but making sure that they are up to date on studentaid.gov is important, and working with your alumni to make sure that they potentially have the benefits to reduce their overall indebtedness, if that still comes to pass, is something that I think is important for all presidents and their financial aid departments to keep in mind. I would also, once again, stepping outside of financial aid, encourage all presidents to spend some time looking at your IT department and your compliance with all of the issues related to IT. The FBI has put out major notices with regard to concerns over ransomware. Many institutions have felt the sting of ransomware and the dark net pulling from the credentials of individuals at colleges and universities across the country and using that as a backdoor to get into the systems and doing harmful damage. So again, I would put that on the list for the presidencies. And last but certainly not least, I would ask them and encourage them to be very, very engaged as the new Congress comes into place in what the student loan programs look like going forward. It's important for the students, but also for us as the administrators of the program. We need to be able to share both the positives and the negatives of the various proposals that have been put out there thus far.
Great wrap-ups, Tom. Well, thank you so much again for being on the program. It's great to reconnect with you, and I look forward to the next time.
As do I. And again, let's not make it quite so long so the podcast isn't quite as long either.
I agree. Thank you, sir. Always a pleasure.
And to you as well, Drumm. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening this week, and a special thank you to this week's special guest, Tom Netting, for his Washington update. Tom, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show, and I look forward to the next time you're back. Our next guest is Lucy Lipovsky, who'll be joining us to share her thoughts on the financial outlook for 2023 and beyond, and what colleges and universities should be doing to grow and remain viable in the post-COVID normal. Lucy is one of the top finance people in higher education, and with her background as an economist, she has some great insights on higher education finance. As the old commercial says, when Lucy Lipovsky speaks, people listen.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.